In today's video, we're going to be styling all of the different form inputs for our application, as well as applying all the styles we created from the last video to the rest of our application, so that we only have a few more pages to style in our next video, which will be the very last video of this series. Let's get started now. To get started, we're going to style our form elements for our new book page, because that's where most of our form elements reside. Instead of our views folder, and inside of our books folder, we can go to our form fields.egis, and inside of here, we can start styling our page with the classes we need in order to make the mockup look just like this. The first thing we want to do is we want to define a class that is wrapping all of our different rows. As you can see, we have a row for title author, publish date, page count, and cover description. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a row. So we'll give this a class here of form row. And the way that I'm going to define this form row class is that every single item inside of it is going to grow to be equal width of each other. Because as you can see, this is 50% of the width, and this is 50%, and so on. For the publish date and page count, and description and cover is going to be a slightly special case we tackle in a little bit. So inside of our form row, we need to add an item. So we're going to give this a class here, which is going to be form item. And inside of the form item div is where all of the different elements that we have for that single section are going to reside. So in our case, that's going to be our title and our input. So let's paste that here inside of our form item. And now we don't actually need to apply any other styles or classes to this label and input, because we'll style them based on this form item class right here. Now let's copy this div down, because we want to have two things in this first row. So let's close that off, and we want to have the next thing be our author. We can remove this title since we already have it defined, and let's copy in our author into this form item. Indent everything as needed, and there we go, that's everything indented. And now we can remove this section that has this author input. Next, we want to create another row that's going to wrap this publish date. So we're just going to give this here class equals form item, which is going to wrap the publish date, and another class here, which is going to be our actual form row. We want to indent this publish date inside of here. There we go. And we want to put page count in there as well. So let's copy this, paste it down, indent everything properly. And we want to give this a class here, which is going to be form item. Now that is all of our different form items taken care of, except for our cover and description, which, like I said, are going to be slightly different. We still want to wrap everything in a form row as we did before. So let's copy that form row down, give us a little bit of spacing here. There we go. Close out that form row, and again, we're going to use a form item in here. And this form item is also going to have an additional class, which is going to be called item no grow. Because as you can see, this cover we want to be as small as possible and not actually grow to fill up 50% of the width. So we're adding the no grow class to that form item. Then we'll copy the cover into this section. Again, indent everything as it should be. We want to close off that form item. Then next, we can do the same thing for our description. We'll just copy that into here, indent everything, and we want this to have a class, which is going to be form item. Now we can remove these down at the bottom, and that's all the different styles we need for our class for our forms defined. Now with that out of the way, let's start up our server, npm run dev start, and as soon as that loads up, we'll open up our server here, and we're going to go to the add book page. And as you can see, of course, nothing is styled as we want it to, so we need to start styling our form rows and form inputs to look like we want them to. And to do that, we're going to go into our public style sheets folder here. We're going to go into shared, create a new file, and we're going to call this form.css. We then want to import that into our main here. So let's just copy this down, change this to be form.css. So now everything in here is going to be included into our actual page. And now we can work on defining our different classes. The first class we want to worry about is the form row itself. This essentially defines how we want to lay out our elements in a row, and we're going to display these using flexbox so that they line up side by side. And we'll also add a little bit of a margin to the bottom of 0.5 rem. Now if you save that, you see things are lining up side by side, but they obviously don't look correct. Next thing we want to do is actually define our form item and how that is going to look. As we remember, the form item contains both our label as well as our input element. So we're again going to use display flex here, but we're going to change the flex direction to be column so that our label will always be on the top of our input element. Next, we're going to do a little bit of a margin. So margin left is going to be 2 rem, and that essentially will space out our elements between each other. We want to set the flex grow to be 1, since this will define our elements spacing out between each other and growing as large as possible left and right. And to make sure that they are the same exact width, we want to set our flex basis to 0 so that they both grow from the same point. Now if we save that, you see that it's looking a lot better like it should. We have our titles being above our inputs and our inputs below, and we have our spacing mostly right. To prevent our cover section from expanding to be the full width, we want to use that form item noGrow class that we defined, and all we need to do is just change flex grow to be 0. Now if we save that, you see that that's no longer growing to be the full size, which is perfect. Now you may notice that our form is indented on the left side here. So to remove that, we just want to select our form item, first child, and all we want to do is remove the margin on the left that we've added to all those elements, and now you can see it's right up against the edge, which is perfect. Now we can move on to styling the actual labels and inputs for each of our different elements. First we'll define the actual label styles because it's much easier. So we're going to select the labels inside of that form item div that we created, and the first thing we want to do is set the font size, which we're going to use a variable for again, since variables make it so easy to change later, and we'll use a variable called form label font size. Next, we're going to use a little bit of a margin on the bottom of 0.25 rem so that they're not quite touching each other. And we're also going to use a little margin on the left-hand side of, again, 0.25 rem, and that'll just make it so that our labels here are inset a little bit. So now let's create that variable. We're going to do so in the root element, and this variable is going to be called form label font size, and we're just going to set this to 1.2 rem. Now if we save that, you can see that our titles are much bigger and they're spaced out a little bit from our input elements. Now comes the tricky part of styling our different input elements, so let's select them all. The first thing that we want to do is select the input elements inside the form item. We also want to select inside of the form item the select elements, since this author is a select box, and we also want to select the text areas that are inside of this, so we're going to select text area as well. Once we have all three of those selected, we can actually start applying our styles to them. First thing we want to do is we want to set a height here of 2 rem so that our text boxes are quite a bit bigger. We then need to apply a little bit of padding to them. We'll just do 0.25 rem and 0.5 rem to space out the text from the borders of our box. We can then use a little bit of border radius to round our edges of 0.25 rem. And let's look back at our mockup to make sure everything's looking good. So far, so good. Next, we want to display the actual border itself. So our border is going to be 1 pixel solid, and we'll use a variable again to define the color. We'll call this form input border color, and that off there. And next we can work on the background color. Again, we're going to use a variable for this. We're just going to call it form input background color. And next we want to define the color of our text, which, you guessed it, it's going to be another variable, which we're just going to call color text light, since we've already defined this, and it's going to be the same color as the text in the rest of our application. Next, we want to change the font size to be 1 rem, we want the font weight to be normal, and we want the font family, again, to be that font family we defined for our application, which is Gotham rounded. And the reason we need to reset our font family and sizing on input elements is because they default to a different font size than your actual application has set. And the last thing we want to do is remove the outline, so we'll set the outline to be equal to none. And now if we save that, go back to our application, you'll see that nothing's actually showing up, and that's because we haven't defined our variables here yet. So let's scroll to the top and do that. The first variable we're going to have here is the color of our background, so we'll use form input background color. This is going to be set again to HSL. We're going to use a var here of our base color. So we have our color base hue. And this is going to be 100% saturation and 31% as the lightness value. We then want to do another form input, and this time we want to use the border color. And this again is going to be HSL with the same exact base hue. So we'll get the color base hue. We're going to set the saturation to be 100%, and the lightness on this one is going to be 50%. And there we go. Now if we save that, you see that our input elements are showing up, which is perfect. It's starting to look a lot like our example over here. But you will notice when we click into an input, we get a nice white colored border that's showing up around the edges of our input elements for every single one of them. So what we want to do is we want to come in here and we'll create a variable for that. We're going to call it input border color, color light. And this is just going to again be an HSL variable, same exact base hue. So it's color base hue. We're going to set the saturation to 100, and the lightness is going to be quite a bit brighter at 80%. Now, if we just scroll down here, we want to select our form item input focus. So essentially when we have clicked inside of that element, we want to do the exact same thing with our form item selects when we focus on those. And lastly, the same exact thing when we do this for a text area. So text area focus. And all we want to do is we want to change the border color to be that variable that we just defined, which is called form input border color light. Close that off, save it. And now if we go back to our example and we click, you can see that we get a nice whiter color around our border instead of it staying exactly the same. But you will notice that our text area here for our description is not the right size, and it also allows us to resize it, which is not something we want. So in order to fix this, we're going to specifically select those. So we'll say form item text area. And in here, all we're going to do is we want to set the height to be 100%, and we want to set the resize to be none. Now if we save that, you'll see that it grows to be much larger, and we no longer have the ability to resize it. And this will always grow to be the same size as the cover element over here, since the height's set to 100%, just as you can see it does over here. One other thing we want to change, which is select box specific, is you'll notice it's kind of difficult to see which ones our select items are since they're the same color as our input element. So let's change that. We're just going to select our form item select, and we want to select the actual options inside of that. And all we want to do is just change the background color to be black. And now when we select inside of these, it's much easier to tell which one we've highlighted over because it's going to be that blue color and the other one is just going to be that black color. Now the last thing we have left to style is this actual drag and drop file upload that we've imported through file pond. And in order to figure out what classes we need to use in order to style this, I went to the file pond documentation and found all the different classes for what we need to style. So the first thing that we want to style is we'll just select our file pond root element, just like this. So this is going to be essentially the container that this file pond object is inside of. And we just want to change the font family to be our font family for our application, which is Gotham Rounded. There we go. And we want to change the margin on the bottom to be equal to 0, because as you can see, there's a little bit of space here at the bottom. And if we save that, you'll see that space is no longer there. Next, we want to color it so it's no longer this ugly white color. To do that, we again select File Pond, but this time we're going to select the panel root. And what we want to do is we want to set the background color. And this is just going to be the same color as our form inputs. So we'll say form input background color. And we want to select the border of this element, which again is going to be the same as our rest of our elements. So we'll say 1 pixel solid, and we want this to be our form input border color. Now if we save that, you see that it's looking a lot better with the same exact coloring scheme as the rest of our elements. And we can work on going a little bit further and defining the actual text coloring inside of it. So to do that, we want to go into File Pond, and we want to select the drop label, which is just this label inside of here. And we want to change the color to be the color of the rest of the text in our application, which is color text light, just like that. And we also want to make it so that the font size is going to be the same font size for our stuff. So we're going to say font size is inherit. But you will notice it's very small and not nearly as large as the example over here. But we're going to fix that when we start changing our actual JavaScript for our file pond object and styling the size of our book covers, because this cover object right here is going to be dependent on the size of our cover images for our books. So for now, we can just leave this as is and work on styling the buttons for our page as well. We know that all of our forms are going to have buttons off to the side. As you can see here, we have our buttons off to the right. If we go to our add author, again, buttons in the same exact place. Our search page has the buttons in the same place. So as you can see, it's very common to have these buttons in the bottom right of all of our forms. So let's go into our new page for our add book. And we're actually going to wrap our buttons here inside of a class. So we're going to say div class, and this is going to be first and foremost a form row, since it's a row inside of our form. We also want to dictate that this is going to be a button row, because as we defined earlier, we have this class called button row, which will allow us to space out our buttons just like they are here, with some margin in between them. Now let's close that off, put our different buttons inside of that, and again, end that div. And now we have our different buttons. We're going to give them classes, so this one is going to be a class of button danger, and we can copy this down, put this onto this button, and this one is going to be our primary button. Now if we go over here, you see that we have our buttons just where we want them, but we want these to be at the end of our row, not at the beginning. So we're going to create a class here, which is just going to be called form row end, which we will define as pushing our elements to the end of the row. If we go into our form.css, we can just easily define this. Let's scroll up a little ways. We'll say form row end, and we just want to define this as justify content flex end instead of the flex start. Now if you save that, you see it pushes our elements to the very end of the row. And that is pretty much all we need to do to define these form classes. So let's go about applying these to the rest of the pages in our application. Let's first create a book here. We'll just give it a bunch of bogus data. That way we have a book that we can work with. And we'll create this book here. Perfect. So now if we go to our edit page, we want to define our buttons on this page as well. So we'll go to our edit EJS for our books, and we're going to wrap these inside of a div. This div is going to have the same exact classes. We'll have form row, we'll have form row end, and we're going to have button row. Indent these properly, close that off, and we want to give these the right classes. So we want to have button and button danger, and we can again copy this down and change this to be our primary button. And there we go, our buttons for our edit page are looking really good. Now let's go to our home page. This is looking good, we don't need to change anything here. Next, let's go to our authors index, and you can see right now we need to apply our form inputs and our button inputs here. So let's open up that page, authors index, and the first thing we can do is we can take our div. We want to have a form row, just like that. We'll indent this, and we also want to have here a class which is going to be form item, which is going to contain our name and our input element. So let's close out those divs, just like that, which is perfect. And then lastly, we have our button, which is going to go into its own form row. So we'll have form row, make sure that's a class. There we go. And we want this to be at the end as well. And we don't need to worry about calling it a button row since it only has a single button in it. Now that that's done, we can indent our button, close off this div. And now if we save that, you see that this is looking much better, but we forgot to add the classes for our button. So here we want to say button and button primary. And now if we save that, you see that this is looking perfect, and it's looking exactly the same as the page over here for this section at the top. Now let's go to the view page for our author, and you can see right here is a perfect example of where we have a button row. Let's go over to that page, show page for our authors, and you can see we can wrap these two buttons inside of a button row. So we'll create a div with the class here of button row, close off that div, indent everything, just like that. Now if we save that, go over to our view, and we want to apply our classes, of course. So here we're going to do a class of button and button primary, and there we go. Now we have our button row showing up perfectly right here, just as it is over here. We also want to apply our page header to this books by author. So down here, we want to do a class, which is going to be page header. We just missed this from the last video, and now if you save that, that looks much better. Now that we have the view page done, let's open up the edit page, and as you can see, we have a lot of work to be done here. Let's first tackle the actual form fields themselves, which is going to be fairly straightforward. All we need to do is create a div here with a class of form row, because as you can see over here, if we click on edit, we just have a single row right here with the name element. And inside of this div, we want to have another div, which is going to have the class of form item, which is going to be that name row. Indent these inside of it, close off all of the divs that we have, just like that. And now if we save it and go back here, you can see that that name input element is looking perfect. Now we can go to the actual edit page and style our different buttons as we need them. Again, this is fairly straightforward. All we need to do is create another class here, which is going to be our form row. This form row is going to also be at the end, so we'll say form row end, and it's a button row, so we can add all those classes in there, indent this, and close that out, and there we go, our buttons are styled off to the side, and we can actually just apply our classes here. So we can say we want to have a class of button, and button primary, actually danger for this one, and copy that down, and this one will be primary. And there we go, our edit author page looks exactly the same between our two different examples. Next, we can tackle the add author page, which is going to use almost the exact same code as our edit page. So let's just copy over this form row code, close out the div down here, and of course add in our different classes for our buttons. So in this case, button and button danger. And then our second button down here is going to be our primary button. And if you save that, you see that this new author page now looks the same as the new author page right over here. Now, I think the last page that we have left to style, besides the show page for the books, is the actual books index page. And we're going to keep the show page for books until later because it involves a lot more than just adding button classes. So for now, let's work on the search books page. So we can go over to here, click on books, and as you can see, we have a lot of work to do. So let's keep this open so we know what we're working with. Open up the index view for the books here, and now we can start putting these different elements into the rows we need. So first we have a div class of form row. This is just going to be our title inside of here, and we're going to give this a class of form item because it's just going to be a single item inside of here. Make sure that we close off the containing div, and if we save that and look over here, our title is complete. Now we can do published after and before. They're going to be almost identical. They're going to be inside of a form row with a form item. So let's indent that, get all of our different closing divs as needed, and we'll do the exact same thing for our form before. We'll just put that inside of another form item right there, which is perfect. We want to make sure that this is indented inside of here and closed off just like that. So now these are all in their own individual row. And as you can see, we have publish after and published before, just as we want. And the last thing we have left to do is this search button right here. So let's go back. We want to put this inside of its own form row. So class is going to be equal to form row. Again, this is going to be at the end, so we want form row end. And since it's a single button, we don't need to worry about using the button row class. And we can just paste that into here, indent it properly, and apply the right class. So we got button and button primary. Now if we save that, look back here, you can see that this is looking exactly the same as our section over here, obviously minus the size of the books. And that's all we need to do to get our general styles on these pages. So let's commit this to Git. So we're just going to add everything. We're going to commit it with a message of saying form setup styles. Commit that. We'll push it to our remote repository. And then of course, we're going to push this to Heroku as well. So we'll say git push Heroku master, just like that. And now if we open this up in Heroku and we go to our add book page, you can see all of our form inputs are showing up exactly as we want them to. And that's all it takes to set up our input styles in our entire application. In the next video, we're going to take a look at finishing our entire application and all the styles involved with it by mostly focusing on the book grid and the book show page. That video is going to be linked over here, so make sure you check it out when it comes out. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more videos from me. Thank you guys very much for watching and have a good day.